In November 2022, Christopher Ward released the Bel Canto, a striking hour watch brought to the masses, a hot horology at an approachable price point. It was an immediate hit, and Christopher Ward knew that they would have to start working on the next watch. They would have to start on the next thing that would end up being a crazy ride to get to it. Crazy enough where they even named the watch the Loco. So let's get into it. Mike France, the CEO of Christopher Ward, said with the Bel Canto, we turned the watch world on its head and proved that hot horology could be both groundbreaking and accessible. Now with the Loco, we're doing it again. When you look at the Loco, you can see where he's coming from. Where the Bel Canto is 70% about the striking hour and 30% about a good design, I think this watch is more 70% about the design and 30% about the mechanics of it. Because it's not as obvious of how hard it is to make this watch. More people are going to appreciate the design than the ridiculousness that is the movement in this watch. But let's start by looking at the movement. First of all, this is not a movement somebody else made for them. This is the in-house Christopher Ward movement. Now, if you're unfamiliar, they've had an in-house movement for a while, the SH21, that they've renamed the CW001, so it's a Christopher Ward. And it's something they designed early on in their life and have brought out for special edition watches. It's generally in a skeletonized watch with open barrels and a long 120-hour power reserve, and usually done to a chronometer rating. It's a great movement, but it's not something that's typical of Christopher Ward because it is a more expensive thing to make versus the Sellita movements and the $1,000 watches they're typical selling. When they bring in their own movement in, the watch price goes up to the $4,000 or $5,000. And that's respectable because that movement is worth that price. So here, that started off as the base of this movement. I say base because everything else about this movement had to get changed in order to create the design of this watch. And they've renamed it for this watch, the CH003. And everything about it is different except for the very, very basic architecture. First off, if you go to the back of the watch, you can see these beautiful finger bridges holding the twin barrels. And instead of being 120 hours of power reserve, it's now up to 6 days or 144 hours of power reserve, which is much more than you'll ever need out of a watch. And it's great. You only need to remember to wind it on Monday and then just not worry about the watch for most of the week after that. The front side of the watch, though, is obviously where this thing just goes off the rails compared to your average watch. The balance wheel is a free-sprung balance wheel. And they've been calling the documentary on making this watch freewheeling because free-sprung balance wheel that's also suspended from a bridge that is hand polished. Nothing you would expect out of a watch from Christopher Ward at this price point, or any other company at this price point, or triple this price point, to be honest. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the difference between a free-sprung balance or a pin regulator, let's just say that a pin regulator is much cheaper to make, much easier to make, and much more common. And it's what you see on most watches because it can be very accurate and is easy to produce. A free-sprung balance is harder to regulate, harder to make, but when you set it, it is more accurate, it is more resistant to shock, it is a better overall design, but it is more expensive and harder to make, which is why you only see it in higher end watches. And Rolex most famously is probably the price point where it starts at and what they've always had. Part of Rolex's ability to be so accurate is the free-sprung balance that's always been part of their movements. And it's becoming more popular. Omega and the Coaxial has it, and Breitling just released the B31 movement that also has a free-sprung balance. But mind you, that has half the power reserve of this watch and starts about $1,300 more. So you're getting a lot of watch from Christopher Ward. And on top of that, it's actually suspended balance. And it looks exactly like what MB&F does. In fact, even the balance wheel looks similar to what MB&F does in their legacy LM1 machine. Absolutely gorgeous. It is not something you expect at this price level. It's not something you expect from Christopher Ward. This is hot horology coming down. And again, this is probably the 30% of what people are looking at. Most people aren't looking at, oh my God, free sprung, oh my God, suspended balance. They're probably looking at the design itself first. And I think this is honestly where this watch shines. You have this almost floating watch face that's surrounded by this brushed shelf that then slopes down into this valley that allows for room for the balance wheel to be suspended above it, and then below it the escapement wheel, all in line. It's a beautiful design that obviously had to be thought of first before the movement was even made, which is another level of problem, because usually you design a watch around a movement because that's just easier. It's how almost every watch is made, with very few exceptions from places like MB&F or a Long 01, where the design actually came first and then they figured out how they'll do it with the movement later. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of dimensions. It's a 41 millimeter watch, 47.5 millimeters lug to lug, very wearable dimensions for most people. And it does technically come across as thick-ish at 13.7 millimeters, but that's not fair to how it actually wears, because nearly 4 millimeters of that is the 2 sapphire crystals on the front and back. So if you put calipers to it, it's going to say 13.7 millimeters, but really it's about 10 millimeters of watch and then a whole lot of sapphire crystal, just so that it can accommodate some of that multi-level of the dial. But it's not going to feel that tall on the wrist because all of that is kind of a clear visual see-through. So that 13.7 millimeter height is a bit misleading. And when you see this in person and see it on the wrist of people, it obviously wears a little easier than that says, even though that is not a very tall watch. That is very much into what you'd expect from a lot of dive watches and other sport watches. So it is not an incredibly thick piece. It just, the measurements aren't true to how thick it's going to really feel. The only downside of the specs is 30 millimeters of water resistance. For a sports watch, that is a little thin. It should be 100 meters of water resistance. Somebody needs to take a gasket and throw it in this crown and fix that. Hopefully that is something that will come at some point, but yeah, that's a little light for this watch. Now to get down to the hot horology price, it's $4,595 on rubber and a few hundred more at $4,825 on bracelet. So again, a very approachable price for everything in this watch. It's just impressive. The 4 colors are beautiful. The black looks solid. Everyone enjoys a black watch. The blue is a little bit light for my taste, but I think a lot of people love it. The orange looks great. I love that orange and the orange rubber strap. Absolute fantastic looking watch. But for me, the winner is the white. I think that white dial really pops, especially on the white rubber. That's where I love this watch. It looks like a great summer watch, and we're just entering the summer. It's a perfect time to get this watch. And if you are interested, Christopher Ward said that these watches will be available immediately, and that there will be a restock at least twice throughout the year of more availability, because they expect this one to sell out and there's going to be a bit of a waiting list, just like with the Bel Canto initially. This is not the easiest thing to produce, but they are committed to producing as many as people want to buy. So good on them for that. So for the true watch nerds out there, you might know the story of Adrian Buckman, who's the chief designer at Christopher Ward. Before he came to Christopher Ward, he was at Chapek, and the Chapek sport watch and the Christopher Ward 12 have been noted for their design similarities because they actually have the same designer behind them. Just like if you looked at old Gerald Gento watches, there's something about them that go together because it's the same designer. There's nothing wrong with that. But the funny thing is that Chapek released a watch recently that has some similarities to this one too. And no, Adrian had no involvement in the Chapek design that came out, but I'm sure that was a fun meeting afterwards, kind of giving him a look of, hey, what the heck? But that Chapek that does look similar to this Christopher Ward Loco does not have a floating free-sprung balance. It's just an open skeletonized dial to look at what's underneath. It happens to line up. It is not nearly as involved as this movement is to make, or this watch of Christopher Ward is to make. The Chapek watch, even with the tourbillon, is actually a lot simpler to design, and it is a lot more expensive. The Christopher Ward is 10% of the price of that watch. So if you like the Chapek, I'm not taking anything away from it, But that should tell you what is involved in this Christopher Ward. That's a much more complicated watch to make, even though the Chapek has a tourbillon at 10% the price. And I think the Christopher Ward looks better. Overall, I think Christopher Ward hit it out of the park. This is bringing hot horology to an affordable price point, just like the Bel Canto. This is the perfect follow-up to what they did there, and they are very proud of it, as they should be. Everyone at Christopher Ward's been talking about this behind the scenes for months, and there's nothing bad to say about this watch except for the water resistance, but it's a beautiful watch. It really is hot horology with the free-sprung balance that's floating, a design that came first and a movement that had to be customized for it. Christopher Ward is pushing the boundaries of what you expect from a small independent brand that is not charging 5-6 figures for a watch, where they're trying to create affordable hot horology. That is absolutely amazing. So great job, Christopher Ward. I look forward to seeing more of this watch in different colors and different designs and seeing what people do with it. I'm looking forward to see what next comes out of Christopher Ward, because this is just cool. Thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments what you think about this watch, the Bel Canto, or anything else from Christopher Ward. Have a good one.